Hmm. Okay, I'm now recording, so I will get the file and get it to you, Peter.
Okay, I'm recording it on our recorder as well. Okay, that's
Okay,
it.
and Hugh, it's over to you now.
Hugh, your microphone is on mute.
Hugh, if you can hear me, press the space bar on your keyboard and hold it down. That will unmute you so you can speak to us.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Hooray.
Yes.
Okay, here we are. Thank you. Well, our traditional hearty welcome to all our members and guests. I'm not sure how many guests we have. I'm sure Jack will keep a record.
We have 100 participants so far.
Oh, fabulous. That's wonderful. A welcome also to our guest speaker, Dan Kalla, who will be joining us shortly at 8 o'clock. We will not be introducing nominated new members at this virtual meeting. If our Zoom conference proves to be a success this evening, we will follow the same arrangement with our monthly meetings.
I don't care, hon. This is actually very interesting. There's all Hugh. They hooked it up right.
Mute, you idiot.
All right. May I carry on?
Carry on, Hugh.
Okay. If our Zoom conference this evening proves to be a success, we will follow the same arrangement with our monthly meetings until we are able to meet in person again. It's of course difficult to predict when that will be. The meetings which Bill Hooker has scheduled are for the second Tuesday of each month at 10 o'clock in the morning as before. The second announcement is that Peter Scott has informed me that the deadline for the next newsletter is May the 29th. Please submit any material you may have for inclusion directly to Peter. Without modern technology, we could not have tried to convene the meeting this evening. However, this is part of a joke as well. Beware that if we could see ourselves as others see us, we would never speak to them again. I would foremost like to acknowledge our immense appreciation of Jack Zaleski's dedicated efforts to organize this Zoom conference.
Here, here.
Yes.
For us, Jack, please raise your hand to be recognized, but of course, people can recognize you on the screen. David Scott had initially made the suggestion on behalf of the Probus Canada to try Zoom conferencing. And just before that, we had Brian Street, one of our newer members, who had enthusiastically endorsed the arrangement. Thank you also to our management committee in supporting our virtual meeting. Before I have the special pleasure to introduce Dan Kalla, our distinguished guest speaker this evening, I would like to quote from The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien, and I quote, "I wish it need not have happened in my time," said Frodo. "So do I," said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times. but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. So now, many philosophers have observed that every crisis has a silver lining. And one today is unquestionably having the company of Dr. Kalla sharing the meeting with us. Dan, I don't know whether you've arrived yet or...
Yeah, I'm here. Nice to see you.
Oh, great, thank you. Dan's esteemed biography has been published in the latest edition of our Probus newsletter, and I hope most of you have read it. Over the last century, there have been literally only a handful of famous authors who have also been doctors. And we are so privileged to have one in our midst. Among those names on the list are Sir Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., Somerset Maugham, who gave up medicine to write full-time, and one Anton Chekhov, who wrote, "Medicine is my lawful wife and literature my mistress. When I get tired of one, I spend the night with the other." Unquote. For Dan, an internationally acclaimed writer, he spends his days and many nights taking care of patients in the emergency room at St. Paul's Hospital. We thank you, Dan, for the extraordinary work you do. Last but not least, this is to remind you that Dan's latest novel, The Last High, has just been published. And it's about the opiate crisis. And I believe that Dan will be making reference to that in his talk to us this evening. Among the books that are recently published, which were reviewed in the Globe and Mail, a Saturday edition recently, The Last High was enthusiastically recommended as a book to read now, right now. So I would encourage you to consider purchasing The Last High, which you can do now online, pending the opening of bookstores for person sales. Now, a reminder of the Q&A session after Dan's talk this evening. Please follow Jack's emailed advice, which he had kindly and diligently sent to you all earlier today, to use the chat box on Zoom to post questions for Dan, rather than trying to raise your hand and speak. So please use the chat box and write your message. That would be very much appreciated. I think that's all I have to say to welcome Dan to our meeting this evening. And I will now hand it over to him to address us. I'm sure we're all waiting in fascination about what he have to say. Dan, welcome. I can't hear you, Dan. I don't know whether others can.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Hugh, for the overly generous introduction. Those are not the list of writers I'm usually compared to. I'm lucky if I get a Robin Cook thrown in there. But
Okay.
anyway, I really appreciate it. I don't know if everybody's muted their microphone. I have a bit of an echo. It'd be easier for me if everyone can make sure their little mute box is on. Or I'm just going to. Can everybody see my first slide there?
Here we are.
Yes. Yep.
Yep, just the probe. Great.
Make the
I don't want to be
decision.
in the picture, so.
I think, Jack, I don't know if you have the ability to mute other people, but if you can mute other people's mics, that would be.
Dan, just stop the sharing for a minute. I lose the ability to see the chat room here, and I don't know why.
Oh, okay, sure.
That might be a problem. Let me.
If you just.
I'm going to mute everyone at this
Yeah,
point.
and then I'll unmute. I'll unmute
and
myself.
That will mute you as well.
Yep.
Okay, everyone is muted. Dan, you can unmute yourself.
I've unmuted myself now.
You can share the screen.
Okay. Okay. Let's try this again. Can everybody see my slide presentation now?
I can.
Yes.
Okay. All right, great. As I said, thanks very much. Thanks to Jack and Bill Hooker, and as I said, especially Hugh for inviting me to the Provost Club. I've been to other Provost Clubs before. They've always been great experiences. There's always such great discussion. And tonight I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes, give or take, and then leave lots of room for questions and answers, which is my favorite part of these discussions. So as Hugh said, please type your questions in the chat, and maybe Jack or Hugh can moderate, and then we can get through a lot of them, I hope. This is a big month for me. My latest novel, The Last High, was launched 1 week ago today, as Hugh said. And to celebrate, I'm going to talk about this cheery topic, pandemics then and now. And it really seems like an appropriate time to discuss the history of pandemics and how they compare and contrast to what we're going through today. I'd also like to talk about another pandemic, which I think is hiding in plain sight. I'm not sure if it's the case for the Provost group, but when I speak at medical conferences, the organizers often collect speaker evaluations, which they later compile and send me. And being a naturally sensitive and competitive guy, I take these evaluations to heart. And if you're commenting now, I'd like you to keep in mind that words can hurt. For example, in 2019, when someone wrote, Kalla has all the medical expertise of a Gwyneth Paltrow and the scientific credibility of a Jenny McCarthy. Or in 2018, when someone wrote, it's very progressive and inclusive of the organizers to invite a speaker who is quite obviously drunk. And that one was fair. 2018 was a tough year for me, but moving on, you know, in the last 15 years, I've been lucky enough to be able to combine my two careers, emergency medicine and creative writing. And in my novels, medicine is my gimmick. I always capitalize on my clinical experience in my writing. I've written about the dangers of superbugs in a novel called Resistance, the pitfalls of DNA evidence in Blood Lies. And I wrote a historical trilogy set around an Austrian Jewish doctor and his family who escaped Nazi Germany to the only place that would have them in the wake of Kristallnacht, the amazing cosmopolitan city of Shanghai. I'm particularly proud of this trilogy as it shares a slice of little known but vital history, particularly about the Holocaust. And it's truly a story of bravery, dignity, and survival. But it all started for me with my first novel, which was truly inspired by my day job. I'm sure everyone remembers SARS now. But back then, in 2003, I sat on the Vancouver SARS task force as director of physician staffing for the short-lived SARS screening clinic. And at one of our first meetings, someone put up a map showing the worldwide hotspots where SARS was. And I was struck by the scattered distribution, China, Singapore, Toronto. I turned to the person beside me and said, how do we know the spread is random, not deliberate? And thus the idea for pandemic hit me. Pandemic tells the story of a fictional bird-like flu that springs up in rural China, which is sadly sounding more and more familiar these days, which terrorists decide to weaponize. And they use these infective operatives as suicide bombers to spread the infection tactically and to try to hold the world hostage to their geopolitical agenda. Needless to say, their scheme doesn't pan out as planned. So I guess it's fair that one reviewer once said of me that Kalla is like Chicken Little with an MD. You know, people often ask me if my two worlds collide, writing and medicine. And nowadays I do see more patients in the emergency room who have read my books. But curiously, the very first person to compliment my writing turned out to be quite crazy. She was one of our frequent flyers, meaning she had over like 100 ER visits. And as soon as she saw me, she said, "Dr. Kalla, I loved your book, Pandemic." And then she proceeded to tell me that she had stopped taking all her psychiatric medications and she launched into a series of bizarre delusions and frankly wacky thoughts. And later when I was referring her to the psychiatrist, I told him that while the poor lady was very psychotic today, she did have this one wonderfully lucid and insightful moment. And you know, there are other times when my two worlds, medicine and writing, seem to sync just perfectly. And often, as it happens, it's when I'm writing about the end of days. So let's talk about some of Pandemic's all-time greatest hits. Here's the top hit list in the terms of deadliness of pandemics. The Black Death, which killed up to 200 million people in its day. The Spanish flu, which killed 50 to 100 million people by estimates. And smallpox, which killed 50 or more million people. But smallpox doesn't really count because it took centuries to accumulate those deaths, whereas the Black Death and Spanish flu happened over a matter of a few years. So COVID would have a hell of a way to go to catch up to these bad boys. But let's talk about what is indisputably Pandemic's all-time biggest hits, and that's the Black Death. The Black Death was a specific form of the bubonic plague caused by this nasty bacteria, the Yersinia pestis. Most people blame this little critter, the black rat, for spreading the plague. In fact, it's spread by these ugly bastards, the rat fleas. Rats are just the most common carriers of the fleas, but many other animals are susceptible as well. The bubonic plague is still with us today. This sad, sort of funny headline appeared last summer. Married couple dies from plague after eating raw marmot meat. Why anyone would eat marmot, or especially raw marmots, a little bit beyond me, but the bubonic plague is still endemic in the US Rockies, and there are sporadic outbreaks in places like Madagascar. But the modern day plague is a pale shell of what it used to be during the era of the Black Death. And this is what the bubonic plague looks like. These so-called buboes are the very swollen, discolored lymph nodes that appear in the groins and the armpits. And they're accompanied by a flu-like illness with fevers and chills, which can be severe enough that it's fatal. The bubonic form of the plague is only spread by flea bites. But, and I have to warn you, the next picture is a bit graphic. In rare cases, the bubonic plague can progress to the pneumonic or chest plague and or septic plague. Chest plague is spread by human-to-human contact, just like the flu or COVID. But the Black Death was truly the mother of all plagues, and it refers very specifically to the second Great Plague pandemic from the years 1347 to the 1351. And by the way, it wouldn't become known as the Black Death until a couple hundred years later. Back then, it was simply called the Great Mortality, if they called it anything. So what made the Black Death so terrible? Well, first of all, the spread. In an age before any travel of any real kind, except for a sporadic traders or a few sailors, it spread from Sicily to Norway and Russia in just under 3 years, suffocating Europe in a time, as I said, when there was no real travel. The second distinct feature of the Black Death was the death toll, which was unparalleled. 25 to 50 million people died in 4 years. 30 to 60% of Europe perished. And this to me is the most fascinating stat. It would take over 500 years, not till the 1850s, before Europe reached its pre-plague population level. Now, you might say that in the Middle Ages, there was no real science of any kind. There was certainly no hygiene, no public health, and definitely no antibiotics. But the Black Death was the worst natural disaster in recorded time. In fairness, the pre-plague Europe of 1340s wasn't a happy place. It was overpopulated for its infrastructure and food supply, and famine and disease and war were already rampant by 1347. But the impact, the devastation was incredible. Some cities like Venice and Paris had greater than 60% death tolls. It wasn't uncommon for 1,000 people a day to perish in these cities when their population was much smaller. They ran out of graveyards and burial spaces and just began dumping the bodies in the rivers and the seas. Another distinct feature of the Black Death was the rate of the chest plague. The pneumonic and the septic plague were rampant, unlike today's plague. Person-to-person spread was incredibly common. Whole villages were wiped out today. There's an old famous medieval poem that went well to bed in the morrow dead. Doctors attending patients, priests giving last rites, and lawyers completing wills all died in droves. I mean, aside from the lawyers, it was really quite a tragedy. But maybe what interests me most about the Black Death isn't all the death, but rather its incredible and lasting societal and cultural impact. Sure, it led to unspeakable suffering, but it also led to a time of enlightenment. The Black Death literally reshaped Western civilization, but it also led to so many oddities, like these clowns, the flagellants. This truly bizarre sect sprang up in Central Europe at the time, and they believed that the plague was God's punishment for man's sin, and the only way to appease God was to punish themselves physically. They would parade through towns, speaking in tongues, covered in their own blood and sweat, as they literally whipped themselves into a frenzy. They became the rock stars, or maybe like punk rock or death metal stars of the Middle Ages. The plague also led to unspeakable acts of cruelty. Parents abandoned their own children for fear of being infected. Towns boarded up infected houses with people trapped inside, leaving them to starve or die of the infection. And one of the first acts of organized genocide, Jews across Europe, especially in France, Germany, and Switzerland, were killed by the thousands. Usually they were burned at the stake after being blamed for inciting the plague, often for so-called poisoning the wells. I mean, in simpler terms, the Black Death, like most pandemics, led people to extremes of behavior. People either became more devout, believing they were suffering for their sins, or they became hedonistic and fatalistic in the ultimate live for today attitude. And just like with the Black Death, today we're seeing that pandemics bring out the best and the worst in people. Like these kind people volunteering in the top picture in the frame to personally donate essential items to those who need them, versus these complete idiots who show up with their AK-47s and congregate in close quarters to protest their personal freedoms at the Michigan State Legislature, as if the virus can read the Constitution. But the Black Death was also weakened the stranglehold of the church and ended the medieval reign of superstition. Literature, art, science all flourished. Also, because of overcrowding, the plague selectively killed off more of the poor and lower classes, which led to a decrease in the supply of laborers, and in turn led to the empowerment of the working class and ultimately the end of feudalism. There probably wouldn't have been a Renaissance without the Black Death, which goes to show pandemics can change societies for the better. And I guess it's digressions like that that might have prompted someone to comment on the speaker evaluation in 2018. Kalla's talk would have been much better if someone else gave it and didn't use his slides. So let's now turn to pandemic's second greatest hit. What a piece of nastiness the 1918 Spanish flu was. This great influenza pandemic infected up to half the world's population, which was only 2 billion at the time. 50 to 100 million people would ultimately die. And unlike COVID, most of the victims were mainly young adults. They were the most susceptible. Soldiers carried it from the front lines and spread it at the end of World War I. And more people died of the Spanish flu than in either world war. As you can see from the graph below, in terms of mortality, it had 3 peaks and the dreaded second wave that you keep hearing mentioned now with COVID. In fact, by the end of 1919, the average life expectancy had dropped 20 years. Here's an army barracks converted to a makeshift hospital in 1918. Does that look familiar? I mean, so much of what we've learned about quarantines, social distancing, etc., came from hard lessons learned during the Spanish flu. This is a really interesting story and a really great example of social distancing. When you compare St. Louis to Philadelphia, it gives a very relevant historic example of how effective social distancing can be. Both cities had very similar populations and they were only 900 miles apart. But in September of 1918, St. Louis decided to cancel their wartime fundraising parade, while Philadelphia did not. More than 200,000 people congregated in the heart of Philadelphia, as you can see in this picture, and the result was catastrophic. Within 2 weeks, tens of thousands of people in Philadelphia died, while far fewer people died overall in St. Louis, as you can see from the huge peak there in that graph. So social distancing worked in St. Louis in 1918. It can work here today. And we really have no choice to practice it again because we don't have any other options, really. A century after the Spanish flu and in the midst of another pandemic, I don't think anyone believes we're winning the war on infectious diseases. Look at all these new infectious threats in 2020. If this slide doesn't depress you, I don't know what will. Moreover, in the last 50 years, we've seen the emergence of Ebola, HIV, H1N1, antibiotic-resistant superbugs, and of course, pandemic is busy again, topping all the charts with its latest hit, the new kid on the block, COVID-19. As of today, there is about 5 million confirmed cases in the world with well over 300,000 deaths. And we can't talk about COVID without looking at a bunch of annoying graphs, right? But they truly are very important. You can see that while the curve is flattening in most places, we have nowhere near won the war on this pandemic. Only a few countries like China and South Korea and New Zealand have truly achieved total flatness. And even still, they're only one tourist away from having the pandemic reignite in their countries. So it all comes back to flattening the curve. Flattening the curve isn't intended to decrease the absolute number of cases, although it almost always does, as per that example I showed you in St. Louis in 1918. It's meant to slow the rate people get sick, to prevent the healthcare system, and therefore the economy, from collapsing like we saw in poor Italy in late March. It's the only real option we have for flattening the curve right now is through social distancing. And you can't just stop once the curve begins to flatten. I love this analogy. The curve is flattening, we can start lifting our restriction now, is akin to saying the parachute has slowed our rate of descent, we can take it off now. We can't take the parachute off yet. And not to make light of a devastating situation, but what is more confusing than this pandemic virus? The information on COVID-19 seems to change or contradict itself by the day, not even including what the US president says. Even for us in the medical business, it's so confusing. I stole these lists of some rules off the internet, and they're quite, I think, funny, but they're funny because they're not that far off the truth. One, you can't leave the house for any reason unless you have to, and then you can. Masks are useless, but you have to wear one. It can save you, or others, or no one, if you can even find a mask anywhere. Animals aren't affected, but there's a cat that tested positive in Belgium, plus a few tigers here and there. They're probably Carol Baskins. The virus remains active on different surfaces for 2 hours, no 4, no 6. We didn't say hours, maybe days, but it takes a damp environment. Or not necessarily, depends if there's 5G. And finally, we have no treatment, except there may be one that apparently is not dangerous unless you take too much, or it may not work at all if you don't take enough. That's not such a terrible summary for the state of affairs with COVID. But I do promise you this, COVID will end, and here's a few theories as to how and when it will end. One, it will burn out through mass infection and herd immunity. That would come at a terrible human cost of tens and tens of millions of lives, so let's hope it doesn't get to that. There will be an effective treatment cocktail. I like to think of HIV as a great example. It took 10 years to find, or 20 years to find an effective treatment, and it took 3 separate drugs working together. But when we did find the right cocktail of drugs, it was very effective. And I think we can use the learnings on another RNA virus, H5V. I bet you by the end of the year, there'll be much better treatments for COVID. The whole thing about will there be a second peak in the fall like the Spanish flu? Well, maybe, but I also think the disease surveillance, we're going to do so much more testing. In the emergency, we're so aware anytime someone comes in with a cough or a fever. I don't think it'll be able to spread silently in the community like it did before we had good testing options. So I don't think we'll see a second peak so much as a rolling wave of little peaks for the next 12 to 18 months until we get a vaccination that's effective. And that's an optimistic estimate of time. In the meantime, social distancing will quell it, and we might need to do a whole rotating series of blocks of social distancing. Every time we have a new flare-up, we all stay inside for a while. I mean, obviously it's natural something as awful as a pandemic like COVID to instill fear and anxiety, but there are times when I genuinely fear for the future of humanity. Like this guy. It's a real picture of a guy who is smoking through his mask in China. I mean, I think as a species, dolphins must have passed us on the intelligence scale by now, and potted plants are probably nipping at our heels. But there is reason for hope. COVID will not be another Spanish flu. Medicine, science, public health has evolved too far for that. Effective treatments will emerge. We will flatten the curve, and we got this. And you know, even though COVID is probably the worst catastrophe in all our lifetime, never before have we been more in control of something. There's nothing the average individual can do about other natural disasters like earthquakes or tsunamis, but each of us can do everything in this case. It's literally in each of our germ-infected hands to prevent the spread of this pandemic. I'd like to spend the last of my time discussing a truly under-the-radar but devastating pandemic that's gripping most of the world right now, at least most of the first world. What I still believe is and will be the worst epidemic of the 21st century, one that I would argue is the closest thing we have to the Black Death or Spanish flu in modern times, since its victims are so relatively young. And that's the opioid epidemic. It's almost pointless to compare the opioid crisis to the COVID pandemic, but I'm going to anyway, if only to establish a few points. The US is the country worst hit by COVID-19, and its death toll is absolutely staggering. As of today, almost 92,000, and the average age of death is around 80 years old. But now compare that to the death from opioids in the US. In the last 20 years, almost 500,000 Americans have died from this. In 2 years before, in 2017 and 2018, almost 50,000 Americans a year were dying. And the average age of death of opioid overdose is in the mid-30s. You might argue that opioid overdose is a lifestyle choice and can't be compared to an infectious pandemic. Maybe, but this stat also includes thousands of first-time users and accidental overdoses. Moreover, it's time we acknowledge and treat addiction as the genetically inheritable illness it is, not a criminal offense or a stigma. And Canada isn't doing much better than the US. As of today, we have just over 6,000 COVID deaths, but we have had almost 13,000 Canadians die in the past 3 years from opioid overdoses. And almost all of them are young, many of whom had to be buried by their own parents. Some tried fentanyl once or didn't even know they were taking it. And many of the actual addicts might have eventually kicked their habits and led full and productive life. It's such a colossal waste of life, what's going on out there. The good news, at least before COVID, is that we were making a difference in this opioid crisis to a degree. The curve has been flattening in the last year or two. But unlike with a viral pandemic, flattening the opioid curve is not enough. These 40,000 plus deaths a year represent 130 people a day in the US dying, and it could go on forever. What's worse is that the opioid crisis is entirely man-made. I mean, I guess if you watch a lot of Fox News, you might believe COVID-19 is too, but 9 out of 10 American opioid abusers were launched down their disastrous path through the use of prescription painkillers, most of which were legitimately prescribed to them. There are so many people to blame for this, including many of my colleagues and myself when we were taught in the 90s that no one should feel pain, and certainly the pharmaceutical industry, which pushed this crap out like cigarettes. So what makes opioids so addictive? Well, opioids bind to the receptors in the brain and the spinal cords, disrupting pain signals, but they also activate the reward centers of the brain by releasing the hormone dopamine, creating a feeling of euphoria or high. And as strong as most users crave that euphoric high, it's more often the fear of horrible withdrawal, the so-called dope sickness that they get so sick from and are so terrified that keeps users desperate to find their next fix. And why do opioids kill so readily? Well, all opioids suppress the drive to breathe if taken in a big enough dose. For the victims, it's the equivalent of suffocating or drowning in room air. But the potency varies so much between individual opioids. It might take 200 tablets of codeine to overdose versus a milligram or less of fentanyl. And as I'll get into later, because of the street product has zero quality control, every time someone uses, he or she is effectively playing a form of Russian roulette. And the reason overdose deaths have climbed 700% over the past 10 years is simple chemistry. Fentanyl is 100 times more potent than heroin. Superfentanyl, analogs like carfentanil, are 100 times as strong as fentanyl, or 10,000 times as potent as heroin. Now, while 1 kilogram of heroin and fentanyl cost roughly the same to produce, about $7,000, on the street, 1 kilo of fentanyl produces multiple times as many hits, and it has a street value of $1.6 million versus $80,000 for the same 1 kilo of heroin. This huge difference in profit is what makes it so appealing to the traffickers and dealers, despite the human costs of this drug. This drug bust in Burnaby from a couple weeks ago netted 20 million, the equivalent of 20 million lethal doses of fentanyl. And those doses become even more deadly if they're cut with the carfentanil or other drugs I referenced. Now, most of the supply of raw fentanyl is shipped or smuggled into North America from China or Mexico. And illicit fentanyl labs across the city, like most cities, it gets cut by fentanyl cooks with all kinds of products and crap, from baking soda to food coloring and God knows what else. And it's processed into these fake oxy tabs that are sold on the street that you see at the bottom of the screen. Often the cooks will add ultra-potent fentanyl analogs to give the product a real punch and save on the amount of fentanyl expended. But there's zero quality control, and the wrong batch can prove incredibly lethal, as I get into in my new novel. I mean, the greed and the stupidity and the malice involved in the criminal fentanyl trade, organized and otherwise, is staggering, especially in Vancouver, which I go into depth to describe. The laundering of fentanyl profits is so well established in Vancouver that it's known around the world as the Vancouver model. You know, when many of us think of victims of fentanyl and opioids, we typically think of images like these: hardcore IV drug users living in a world completely detached from the rest of ours. But as I said before, these are people too. None of them chose to end up here. They have mothers and fathers and sisters and kids often as well. And sometimes we think of movie stars and rock stars who have lost their way, like all three of these major talents who've died in the last 5 years from opioid overdoses. But the truth is, opioids do not exclusively kill hardcore addicts. These are all real pictures for you. And the people often the highest risks are often the first-time dabblers or relapsed addicts whose systems have no tolerance for the extreme potency of fentanyl. There are also countless examples of people who die from opioids unaware they've ever consumed them. The victims truly come in all shapes and sizes, every age, gender, and socioeconomic standing. And the collateral damage is enormous. Look at that bottom right picture. That is a real picture of a couple passed out from a fentanyl overdose in the car. And there's their son, completely confused in the back seat, potentially watching his parents die in front of him. I've tried to capture all of these themes in my new book. The Last High is a gritty, realistic look at the opioid crisis in Vancouver. And it tells the story of an ER physician, a former addict herself, and a homicide detective who team up to track down the source of an ultra-potent fentanyl that kills a group of unsuspecting teens and threatens to kill so many more. While The Last High is fictional and is meant to entertain like a good thriller does, but the book explores the perfect storm of greed, crime, addiction, and misguided policy that fuels this deadly epidemic. And I could believe it could easily happen tomorrow, pretty much as I describe it. It's also probably the most personal novel I've ever written. Working at St. Paul's for the past 20 years, I've lived through the opioid tragedy, sometimes on a daily basis, and this may be the most important message I've ever tried to tell. The opioid crisis touches and can touch anyone. And I want to read a short passage that I hope will help illuminate the pervasiveness of opioids and fentanyls in our community. So this is the prologue, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Prologue. The house music courses through Alexa. The hypnotic beat and melting lures of sound feel as if they come from within, as if her heart is the amplifier. And the warmth is so enveloping, like being lowered into the most perfect bubble bath. The bliss is almost unbearable. Alexa can't lift her head off her chest, but she can move her eyes. With a quick sweep of the room, she sees all the friends who matter most to her. Rachel, Nick, Joshua, Grayson, and Taylor. The only ones who matter at all, really. Taylor, her very best friend, is slouched at a weird angle on the couch beside her. Taylor had promised to ensure Alexa got some alone time with Josh at the party, even though she had a crush on him too. Typical Taylor, always putting friends first. Her eyes are still open, but the pupils are tiny as pinholes. And her complexion, it's grayish blue, while her lips have turned almost purple. So strange, but so beautiful. Alexa shifts her gaze to the left and sees Josh and Gray sprawled out on the other couch, propped up only by their abutting shoulders. Josh's eyes are as glassy as Taylor's, while Gray's are shut altogether. They're both so still. And Josh's exposed arms are mottled deep dark blue. Alexa wishes she could tell him how much she loves him. Tonight was supposed to be the night. Alexa looks down at her own hands. Her fingers feel foreign to her, and the color of her nails match those of Taylor's lips. She knows it's not right, but it's still so wild. The floating warmth intensifies. Alexa feels as if she's falling off the couch, even though she's not moving. She's never drunk anything more than a beer or two in her 16 years. How could one cup of Nick's punch make her so woozy? Somewhere in the back of her brain, she can hear her mother's panicked voice, a distant scream telling her to breathe. But her mom's nowhere near the party. Alexa finds it all kind of funny. She wants to laugh. She wants to tell Taylor how exquisitely wrong it all is, but she can't even move her lips. Besides, dreams are stealing over her now, and she can't hold on any longer. So that's what happened to the teens of the party. If I have just another minute or two, I want to read one last also very brief passage, because it alludes to what I was telling you about the quality control issues with the drugs in this city. And so this is from the point of view of one of the fentanyl cooks who makes the drugs in his lab. Chapter 13. Bunsen always feels edgier, almost claustrophobic under the bulky gas mask. Plus his face gets so warm and itchy. But it's better than the alternative. One good whiff of all the powder floating around him might be enough to kill him. Sometimes he finds it funny when he catches glimpses of himself in the mirror in his mask, like he's living under chemical attack in Syria or something, instead of working in a kitchen that has been converted into a makeshift lab inside a rundown house on Vancouver's east side. Fortunately, his landlords are understanding. After all, they also own the drugs he's processing. 3 years ago, Bunsen was a student at UBC, struggling to pay off student loans while slaving away on an undergrad chem degree that might or might not help him land a job as a barista. He wasn't Bunsen back then. He didn't become known by the nickname until some asshole who got him into the trade made a joke about being glued to a Bunsen burner. Not only was the quip not funny, it wasn't even accurate. Bunsen doesn't synthesize fentanyl, or Fenny as most users call it. It comes to him in the form of concentrated fentanyl powder from Guangdong or wherever the hell in China they pump the stuff out like salt. He only cuts it with the proper proportion of active ingredient and additives to get the dosage right before pressing it into pills, or fake oxys as they're known on the street. His favorite additives include baking soda starch, crushed ibuprofen, and Tylenol, and of course coloring, but never the talcum powder or rat poison that some of the other dicks use while cooking up Fenny. Still, the nickname is stuck, and most of associates don't even know his real name. For that reason alone, he's grateful. Bunsen already made more money in the past 2 years than he expected to make in a lifetime, but the demands never end. It's almost 2 in the morning and he's always behind schedule. He's been working all day without a break, and he only now has finished cutting the last batch. He views all the containers stacked with precious cut powders, unable to even calculate their enormous street value. Bunsen's back throb and he craves a coffee and a cigarette, but all he has time for is a little bump off the raw powder. He steps out of the kitchen, lifts his mask, and takes such a small snort that he doesn't even consider it getting high. Just something to settle his nerves and lessen the back pain before he sits down at the elaborate pill press machine to crank out the rest of the roughly 100,000 fake tablets they're expecting by morning. What would the Workers' Compensation Board make of such inhumane conditions, Bunsen wonders, only half jokingly. The WCB couldn't protect him from his employers. No one could. If he let those sharks down, he would find himself floating in pieces in the Fraser River or wherever the hell else the triad prefers to send their messages these days. The Fenny kicks in, his backache is gone, and he feels pleasantly grounded again, ready, almost eager to get back to work. Besides, time is wasting. Bunsen reminds himself as he lifts the nearest container, which feels hardly heavier than a bowl of popcorn. He's constantly amazed that so little powder can make so many pills, which in turn will give users, countless users, the high they crave, and probably kill a few along the way. But Bunsen doesn't like to dwell on those details. Besides, it's not his responsibility. He's neither a dealer nor a supplier. He's merely the cook. So as I said earlier, in BC, and we have made a bit of a difference. In this one study, they found that we've avoided 5,000 overdose deaths with our harm reduction strategies, like take-home naloxone kits, the antidotes, safe injection sites, enhanced addiction services, and finally, opiate agonist or replacement therapies like Suboxone. We used to use methadone more, but we have a much better drug called Suboxone now. But just when we had started to see the curve flatten on the opioid crisis, we're seeing another spike in overdose deaths because of COVID. Last month alone, or at the end of March, 113 people died of drug overdoses in Vancouver, which was by far the highest total in the last 2 years. And it's partly because less social services are available, but it's also because users are more likely to use their opioids alone for fear of exposing themselves to COVID-19, which is ridiculous because their chance of dying of opioids alone is so much higher. But we can apply some of the same aggressive approach we have to dealing with the opioid crisis at my hospital and elsewhere, with the COVID crisis, to the opioid crisis, and we can really make a difference. So just to summarize what we've learned this evening, aside from the fact that in this life you generally get the quality you pay for, pandemics are inevitable. They're cyclical, and we will get more. We've survived worse. Good things can come from pandemics. We can apply our pandemic response that we've invested so heavily into other crises like homelessness, poverty, and especially the opioid crisis. And finally, the opioid epidemic will be with us long after COVID-19 is quelled. Not to blow my own horn, but I thought I'd end on a high note and share a positive review I received in 2017 when someone said it was a bit dull and not very informative, but overall you did fine, dear. And that was my mom. So I don't think I've ever been more proud of a story than The Last High. I mean, I think it's a solid thriller and a good whodunit, but entertainment aside, I really meant it to be a cautionary tale. If you have teenage grandkids or other people you know in their 20s, I really hope you'll convince them to read it, because no one is truly immune from this scourge. And thank you for your attention. I'll turn it back to Hugh and company now. So I see that, well, how do we get?
Thank you, Dan. I would like to call on our friend and colleague, Dr. Peter Kuperberg, to express a few words of thanks to this wonderful evening of hearing Dan on these various pandemics. Peter, would you kindly...
Hugh, do you want me to answer any questions before that point?
Sure,
or?
yes. Good idea.
So there's a few already up on the screen, and
Okay.
I'm welcome to take more. So,
yes.
Jack, should I just read the questions that?
That would be perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Somebody wants me to share the PowerPoint presentation, which I can do. So somebody asked, what are the lessons from COVID-19 going forward? You know, I think we're learning them by the day, but you know, it's funny because first of all, I think we've learned so many mistakes. You know, so many governments have mishandled the COVID-19 crisis. Clearly, you know, some countries have done better and some countries have done worse. The WHO is under attack, as you know, by the Trump administration and other places. clearly share some of the blame. They arguably didn't respond quickly enough. But I think the one lesson we can learn is that when we get a warning from the WHO and the CDC that we need to respond quickly to it. I think every country that put social distancing, that put strict measures in place quickly, countries like South Korea, which were so good about testing and so good about tracking cases, proved how you could limit the spread of this pandemic. And other countries, you know, who didn't, are really paying a terrible, terrible price right now. So, you know, I mean, I'm not an expert on these are just my opinions, but I think the other thing is that the medical community could have been more prepared as well. I mean, we've had a pandemic plan for as long as I've worked in the emergency department, but no one's dusted it off in 25 years. Nobody's looked at it. We should have known this was coming. We should have been prepared. We should have stockpiled PPE and all other things. And I hope forevermore we'll take this lesson. COVID-19, the Spanish flus, they were not a fluke. What was a fluke is that we went 100 years without seeing a terrible pandemic. Yeah, so that somebody else asks, first of all, 2 questions. One, if my next story will be COVID-19 storyline. I am so sick of COVID-19. I am so sick of pandemics. So I hope I don't break my word to you when I promise you my next book will not be about COVID-19 or a pandemic. Actually, I know what my next book about. It's about vaccine and the anti-vax movement. So you'll hear a lot of it. Hopefully you'll hear a lot more about that if I ever come back and see you guys again. Why does it appear that law enforcement is unable to shut down the fentanyl labs in Vancouver? Well, partly because the criminals are so sly, and partly because it's so easy for them. You know, importing fentanyl from China, first of all, fentanyl wasn't even illegal in China until about 2 years ago. And to get, you can order by mail up to a couple 100 grams of fentanyl, and they won't even check the mail when it comes in. It's like dealing with a rat infestation. Every one time you stomp out some rats and control one infestation, there's 100 to take the place. This is such a profitable business for the criminals. They're so short-sighted. They don't care that they kill their clients. All they care about is the huge amount of money they make, and it's so easy for them to set up these crappy little labs and print out their pills. What has to happen to really stop the criminal side of fentanyl is A, decriminalize opioids, I believe, but B, stop the supply, prevent it from coming in from China and Mexico. And until they do that, they'll never end the opioid epidemic. Next question. That's an interesting question. With COVID, is there a concern that overdoses will not be ventilated? Well, certainly not in Vancouver. You know, our ICU capacity was so underused, thank God, during COVID. At one point, only 23% of our ICU beds were filled a couple of weeks ago. And that's for all comers, not just COVID patients. We were so lucky in BC to escape the worst of it. So we've had so much capacity to ventilate whoever we need to. Maybe in New York, it would have been a concern a month ago, but even they never exceeded their ventilator capacity. Yeah, someone asks, how do I compare the approach of Sweden to the rest of Europe with COVID-19? Well, today a story came out. That the rate of increase in Sweden, the rate of ventilated patients and deaths, is the highest per capita in Europe this week. As most of you know, that in Sweden they decided to take a more permissive approach and keep schools open and limit social distancing to on a personal basis. And it's been the grand experiment. Everyone wonders how it would turn out. It really hasn't turned out that well. If you compare it to Finland, if you compare Sweden to Finland, Norway, and Denmark, their nearest neighbors, they have 10 times as many cases per capita and 10 times as many deaths. So I would not endorse the Swedish model at all. With all the mixed messages, should we be using masks when we go out? That's a great question. They think in the US, the one thing that stopped a lot of the spread is masks. And as probably most people know, masks do more to protect other people from the virus than yourself from the virus. But certainly if I had any medical conditions, if I was concerned, I'd wear a mask. Why not? It's easy, and everybody should be able to get their hands on one. But I think, as somebody points out, Bonnie Henry said it's a personal choice, and I agree with this. Somebody asked, when did I foresee the outbreak in Wuhan could spread around the world? I didn't actually, and I really thought, I thought it would spread, but I didn't think it would turn into a pandemic until about February. Interestingly, I was speaking at UBC 2 months ago when it was just beginning to peak, and I was with an excellent public health epidemiologist who also spoke with me, and she didn't predict it either. No one really, I don't think, even the people truly in the know didn't see it coming as bad as it came. Yeah, somebody asked, there's evidence that the Spanish flu might have originated in China. That's a lot of truth to that. It's certainly possible. It's also possible it originated in the US at a military base. Where it didn't originate was in Spain. There's a complicated history of why it got called the Spanish flu, but it never was in Spain. It got to Spain, but it certainly didn't start there. Yeah, somebody asked about the benefits of healthcare delivery from COVID-19, our experience with COVID-19, and that's a good question. I think we've learned a lot. We've learned to be facile and quick on our toes. Like in my emergency department, you wouldn't believe how quickly we created hot and cold zones, how quickly we separated spaces between patients. We really rejigged our entire emergency in a couple of days, and that happened all over the world. Human resourcefulness and innovativeness when we're facing an existential threat is really quite impressive. And I think if we could apply that flexibility and not be so set in our ways, we could improve a lot of things about the healthcare system. How could the virus survive if we hypothetically have completely locked down for 2 months? It can't exist outside live tissue. That's true. The virus cannot exist outside. Viruses do not live on their own. They need a human host or whatever animals they live in, but in this case, a human host to keep living. But the point is, as much as we did social distancing, we never truly quarantined all of society. You would have had to shut down society, not cared for the people who needed it in long-term care homes and prisons, not provided food or gas or anything. The idea of completely quarantining the world for 2 weeks to stop it from spreading is too extreme. Too many people would die of too many other things. So the truth is, all we've done is social distance. We haven't quarantined society. And when an outbreak is spreading silently and you don't know exactly where it is, it will keep spreading in spite of social distancing. Social distancing just flattens the curve. It doesn't stop it altogether. Yeah, that's a good question. Should we have moved seniors in care homes to hospital as soon as they tested positive? So many have died in the care homes. Well, the truth is they would have died just as quickly in hospital. For those patients, once they had the COVID virus with all their comorbidities, all their other sicknesses, they would have died. What we should have done, like Quebec is a disaster because almost all care aides work part-time in the nursing homes, and they move from one nursing home to another, and they're just vectors of the disease, spreading it around. We should have had much better standards where people aren't allowed to work in multiple care homes. The people in the care homes are separated better. There's tons of learning. It's tragic what's happened to residential care for seniors in the world. It's, they are by far the biggest victims of this virus. Somebody asked if the U.S. approach is referred to as taking the punch. Well, there's some people in the U.S. I'd like to give a punch to, but I don't know if that's the term. The U.S. truly has never been as extreme as Sweden or as lax as Sweden about their approach. But I think it's the inconsistency and the slowness of their response and the misinformation that comes out of the White House and the confusion that's led to so much of the issues in the U.S. So that's somebody asked me what surprised me about COVID-19 relative to what I knew when I wrote Pandemic. With all my soapbox espousing, I shouldn't have been surprised by this at all, right? I said another Spanish flu is coming several times in Pandemic and other books, And yet I was as surprised as anybody when this showed up. I can't believe how insidious this virus has been, how its incubation period can be for days to weeks, how many different forms it takes, how many hosts it can hide in. It's just the perfectly awful virus for causing the economic, social, and health crisis that it has. Somebody asked, yeah, if we need a Trump to have the wisdom to close the border to China and Mexico. You know, obviously I have a different viewpoint on Trump, but the truth is the cases in most of the cases in New York, for example, they've done genetic testing. Most of those cases did not come from China. They came from Europe. So shutting the border to China, and none of the cases came from Mexico. So shutting the borders to China was not what would have prevented the virus. And it's why the US has the worst outbreak anywhere in the world. It was European cases that caused the crisis in the US. Somebody asked, what's the greater risk, airborne transmission or COVID contaminated surfaces? Well, technically, COVID isn't airborne. It's what's called droplet. Airborne is something like TB or measles, where the virus is so small it can get in a ventilation system and spread around the building. COVID can only spread about 6 feet when it's in the air, but it's very contagious. It's spread through sneezes and coughs. Apparently sneezes are worse than coughs for spreading COVID. And apparently I just heard today, coincidentally, that it's much more contagious when it's spread through the respiratory or on people's hands. I mean, the truth is most viruses are spread from hand to hand touching, but it is apparently more contagious from human to human than it is on any contaminated surface. Wow, thank you. Somebody said, thank you, Dr. Kalla, you opened my eyes today. I'll buy 10 bucks. Keep fighting, Toff. That's very kind. You've become my favorite fan. So somebody asked, it's a good question about Israel. They said 75% of people survived on a ventilator compared to 15 to 20% here. That's not true at all. The survival rate in Vancouver on ventilators was 93%. So 9 out of 10 people who've been on ventilators have gotten off the ventilators. Vancouver's done a terrific job. And in Canada, it's upward of 80%. In Italy, at its worst, the survival rate was 50%, but they didn't know, they've learned so much more about how to better which patients to ventilate and how to manage them better than they knew in Italy. So we've made huge strides. Israel has done very well fighting the pandemic, but so has Canada, particularly on the ICU critical care side. The survival rate is very impressive. Most of the people you hear about dying in Canada are what we call the DNR, the no code status, where they're not to be put on a ventilator in the first place. Somebody said, well, I appreciate your criticism of the Swedish approach. Don't we have to wait a year or two to decide if it was or wasn't the right thing to do? You could well be right. I don't know. I think it's already proving that it'll be the wrong thing to do. The thing about this virus is it grows exponentially. I do not believe that Sweden is going to establish herd immunity and protect everybody. When they looked at studies of New York, you know, in the worst place hit areas of New York, and when they did blood testing for antibodies, only 20% of the people in the hardest hit epicenter of the epidemic were positive for COVID antibodies. That meant 80% were still vulnerable. That's nowhere near herd immunity. You need to get to 80 or 90% of people who have had it and developed antibodies before you get herd immunity. And the way to herd immunity ultimately will be a vaccine, we hope and pray. So I don't think the Swedish model is going to accomplish that. Bill asked about film options. Best way to spread the message about film options? Well, if any of you know Steven Spielberg or others, that would help. But the truth is that I've had my books optioned several times, a few of them. The Shanghai trilogy, which some of you may or may not have read, is now under serious option to try to be developed in an extended TV series. But I've been disappointed so many times by the film business. I'm like always the bridesmaid when it comes to film and TV. So I don't count on anything, but you know, I won't give up hope. I'll keep you posted, I promise. So I think I answered the questions about the long-term care home, how we could have looked after the seniors better. We could have controlled the staff movement from place to place. And so I'm not going to get back into that. Oh, I'm sorry. Jan corrected that she was talking about the opioids from Mexico and China. Yeah, I don't know how you close the border. Half of our products, half of our manufacturer, our bought goods come from China. It's not so much couriers bringing, it's not people, it's not tourists and people bringing it in as it's shipped in containers and other things. So I don't know how you can stop the opioids that way. I mean, what you do is with better border control, with stricter measures in China for stopping the factories that produce it. I don't think you can just stop the flights and hope to talk to. Thank you. Somebody congratulated me on the talk and said, and Rob and Jamie's parents. That's great. Say hi to the boys for me. And could COVID have developed randomly by nature or careless biological experimentation in Wuhan labs? I think, again, I'm not an expert, but everything I've read suggests that, first of all, it's very hard to genetically engineer what's called an RNA virus. It's never really been done before. And there's tons of evidence that the virus emerged in the wet markets in Wuhan, which are under terrible control with all the cross-contamination of species. But there's not a lot of evidence that genetically, I don't think there's proof that or suggestion that it emerged from a laboratory. Some people think it might be a naturally occurring virus that was contained in a lab and leaked out. Even that, I don't actually believe. I think there's a ton of conspiracy theories around this. I think these viruses emerge naturally all the time. There's something like 1,000 coronaviruses in various animals that have never made the jump to humans at any given time. So I don't believe that that you need a laboratory to create this. And yeah, some Jan's saying they use bats in a Wuhan lab. That may be true, but they also have bats in the wet markets of China. So I don't think there is true. My belief, I don't pretend to make myself or to represent myself as an expert on this subject, but I believe that it occurred naturally. So that's the end of the. Oh yeah, somebody just asked another question. Is the real number we can rely on the deaths because we don't know who is being tested and how many are not tested? That's such a good point. Don't for 1 second, when you looked at that slide and said there were 4 million cases and 300,000 deaths, don't for 1 second think that 8 or 10% of people who get this virus die. I think we'll find out that there's 10 times as many people with this virus as we know. We haven't tested, and death is the one accurate measure. Death, ICU admissions, and hospital admissions. We capture all of those people. So I think we capture those people accurately, but I honestly think that there's way more cases than we know about. So it means the mortality rate is much lower than they suggest, probably 1 or 2%, but it doesn't help the 400,000 people who are going to die from this virus, and it doesn't help the most vulnerable people to this virus. So somebody just asked, what happened to the non-COVID volume in the ER? Our volumes plummeted in the ER. Everybody stopped coming to the emergency. In Vancouver, we were down about 50%. And we were actually quite worried. I mean, we knew people weren't going outside and getting injured, but we thought people were having strokes and infections and other things at home and were too terrified to come into the hospital. And I think we'll find out that a lot more people died at home during this COVID because the collateral damage, it's not just the opioid crisis. I told you about that collateral damage, but this has caused so much collateral damage. All the people with cancer and other issues and hip replacements and heart disease waiting for urgent surgery that have been put off. This, the economy, the mental health crisis this is going to cause, the collateral damage has been enormous from this virus. And I think sadly, we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg with that. Bill asked, have I seen a kamikaze case? And I don't know what that means. I haven't heard that term.
Somebody wants it on purpose and commits suicide with it.
Oh, with COVID? No, I haven't seen anything like that. And somebody's asking about Kawasaki's disease, that kids get that rather severe, what's called a vasculitis or inflammation of the blood vessels. No, we haven't seen many kids at all with COVID in the hospital. And Kawasaki's disease is incredibly.
Hospital, that's why.
What's that? I don't think even at Children's Hospital they have. I go to regional meetings. I haven't heard about any, but Kawasaki's disease is extremely rare. The only reason they picked it up in the U.S. is because they had 5 or 10 cases in New York, which is 5 or 10 as many as they were expecting. It's not like they had an epidemic of Kawasaki's disease. The truth is, kids can carry this virus and they can die of it, but for the most part, they do better than the rest of us with this virus. This virus is very age specific. The older we are, the worse it targets us. Hugh and Bill and Jack, I don't see any other questions, so should we wrap it up here? Or?
Thank you very much, Dan. That's an amazing way of spending a Tuesday evening in the early summer. We so appreciate you being here today. And so now I will ask Peter Kuberberg to express our thanks and appreciation to you. Peter? Is Peter still here? Jack?
Peter, you've got to unmute yourself, my friend.
Unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I was using the space bar. I guess that doesn't work. Anyhow, I heard you give a talk similar to this to Radiology Grand Rounds a few weeks ago. And I heard you give it, I think, several years ago, 10 years ago maybe, at Whistler. And it's always been interesting every time. I have seen you put up those reviews that you got. And I'm sure that you're not going to get any bad reviews from this that you'll be able to use on slides in future talks. I also imagine you're very much in demand to give talks all over the world at this point, and it's easy because you could do it all by Zoom without leaving your office.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
That's pretty good. Anyhow, greatly appreciated. The other thing that you've accomplished is you've attracted 150 old men to listen to you on Zoom. And I bet at least 75% of us didn't know how to use Zoom before Jack helped us get to using it. So thank you very much on all fronts, Dan. It was great to see you.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. That's great. I did give a similar talk to Radiology Rounds. I did not have this talk 10 years ago. It's all new to me, but you're absolutely right. It's such a pleasure. I love coming. It's great to come to a male Probus club. The last couple I went to were all women, so it's great, and I'm happy to come back. You guys always ask the best questions and are the most engaged. And if you do get a chance to check out my new book, please let me know. I'm really proud of it, and I hope you will. So thanks again, Hugh, for inviting me and all the rest.
One other thing, it's very reassuring. I thought that only 15% of people would survive if they were told they were going to be on a ventilator. And I imagine me lying there and the intensivist said, "We're going to put you on a ventilator." I said, no, please don't do that. But if I have an 95% chance, not so bad.
Yeah, let them do it.
Where does the 15% come from? That number?
Oh, I hadn't seen 15%, but I had seen 40% in Italy at its worst, and they've learned a lot how to ventilate people better. There's a lot that they're doing differently. So, and 93% is particularly good. I would give your odds maybe more like 80%, Peter, especially after 60 or 70. It drops a little bit, but it's still pretty good.
Thank
you, Dan. We will call the meeting to a close, and we look forward to the next opportunity when we can find one to invite you back again. It's been a wonderful evening.
You.
Very many
thanks. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks.
Jack, are you there still?
Is it over?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, I'm here now. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Jack.
We can hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
So I think the meeting is over, so I'm going to terminate it. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack.
Good night. Stay safe, folks.
Thanks a lot.